Hello class, this is Case Study 2 Part 2. Today we're going to wrap up our discussion of wild-caught shrimp as well as conclude this entire case study on ocean health. In our last part of the case study, we discussed aquaculture, which is to say the technique in which seafood can be farmed. And of these methods, really only one of them can be sustainable, but even that one has issues. So the types of aquaculture techniques includes open net pens or cages, ponds, raceways, shellfish cultures, and recirculating systems. And recirculating systems really have the promise of being the most sustainable. However, they do come at a cost, specifically the cost of electricity. They cost a lot of money to run, and of course electricity is not always provided from green sources, such as burning coal and other fossil fuels. Also, some farmers that use recirculating systems do not properly treat the wastewater. They just dump it right into the rivers, lakes, or oceans, and so then it kind of defeats the purpose of using this sustainable technique. So if farming is so destructive, why don't we continue to rely on wild-caught shrimp and fish? Well, the short answer is most commercial fishing practices are highly destructive. And specifically, it's the way that most shrimp is caught that actually is so destructive. This can impact biodiversity around the world when we try to get these shrimp out of the ocean. So now we're going to move away from farmed shrimp and start to look at wild-caught shrimp techniques. The way fishing is done locally impacts our global stocks of fish. And we can also look at the flip side of this, in which irresponsible fishing practices done on a global scale impact local economies and local stocks immensely. This would be an example of the tragedy of the commons. So what are some ways that both fish and shrimp in the wild can be caught by commercial fishing boats? Well, the first technique is called trawling. And trawling is probably the most disruptive fishing practice that is done around the world. Why do we still do trawling? Well, because quite simply it's the fastest way to maximize your catch so that you can make the most money. But trawling involves dragging a net with very heavy weights along the bottom of the seafloor. Shrimp are considered benthic crustaceans. That means they live in the benthos region of the ocean, which is the bottom of any body of water. And so trawling targets this benthos region and completely destroys this very important community. Another term is pelagic. Pelagic organisms are those that live in the middle of the water column, and they can get sucked into these nets sometimes as well. So trawling really impacts all organisms that live in most communities of our global oceans. In this figure from another textbook, it shows us the benthic community's importance to coastal estuaries and how these organisms that live in the benthos are really essential members of the food web. And if these members disappear, the entire food web will collapse. Now, as I mentioned, this trawling technique that gets the shrimp for these different fishermen is highly destructive because it maximizes what we call bycatch. And bycatch describes living creatures that are caught unintentionally by the fishing gear. Unlike target species, which are the animals specifically targeted for capture, bycatch is unwanted and often unused. The bycatch animals usually die, and then they are just thrown overboard. So you might be asking yourself, okay, these shrimp techniques are destroying the benthos and are wiping out non-targeted species. So why does this matter? What is the take-home message? Well, this practice has a long-term effect on biodiversity. It can take decades or even hundreds of years for these organisms and their populations to come back. When we remove organisms from the benthos, the entire food web can collapse. It can be very difficult for these fragile systems to recover, especially if there's a disturbance like a hurricane or even more fishing pressures put on these global systems. Finally, when we destroy this benthos system and we destroy these non-targeted bycatch species, we ultimately see a decline in ecosystem services and goods, which will impact human populations on land as well. Now, trawling isn't the only destructive shrimping or fishing practice. There's other types of fishing gear that can also be hugely destructive. For example, longline fishing can be destructive because by putting hundreds or thousands of hooks on a line, you can catch lots of non-target surface animals such as sea turtles. Also, large nets can be a problem because things like dolphins can get stuck in those large nets. This figure shows us what the long lining practice looks like. Those lines hang through the pelagic zone and the baited hooks target those larger types of fish. However, many other organisms that are bycatch get on there, including things like sharks or even things like seabirds and sea turtles and other organisms can get stuck on these hooks as well. Long lining can be a highly destructive process. Now, in the wild, you can see that trawling makes up more than half of the fishing gear. And then after that is a type of net called a purse seine. And then all these other techniques we're talking about, long lining, dredging, poling, lots of different techniques make up a lot less, but they still have a substantial impact on our pelagic system. All right, so now we're going to go to our conclusion of this case study. Current research shows that there are fewer big predatory fish swimming in our world's oceans, and we believe that this is because of overfishing by humans. Now, when we remove these large fish, it leaves the smaller fish behind, and they can thrive, and they can double in their population sizes. So food webs can sometimes adjust, but typically when we remove these top predators, it does cause huge problems. So we've seen instances where both fishing and farming in our global oceans can be bad ideas. But I'm not saying that they're all bad, right? We need fish. Remember, over 16% of our world's population relies on fish as their primary protein source. It's all about the methods by which these organisms are fished or farmed. We want to consider these options when we make decisions in the grocery store. So now we could ask ourselves, what can we do? Is there any way that fishing can ever be sustainable? Well, few wild biological resources can sustain a harvest at the level that meets even low requirements for any growing business. So if a business wants to make money by fishing, it's really hard for them to do so sustainably. We can turn to fish farming and aquaculture, but as we've seen, fish farming also has many problems. So if that's the case, why don't we try to purchase fish that were harvested sustainably? And there are some techniques that are the least destructive. For example, pots and traps. Now, the pot and trap method in general is a good method because these traps are relatively small and they target the organisms that we're trying to catch. gill netting can be very sustainable in some areas, especially if there's a large group of fish like salmon spawning in one area. Then a gill net can capture those salmon very rapidly and minimize bycatch. And hook and lining, which is also called poling or pole catching, can definitely be the most sustainable because that's where we catch one fish at a time, and if we get unwanted bycatch, the fisherman can throw it back. Now, for these different global fishing operations and international fishing corporations, they can implement things such as bycatch reduction devices. These can be better, but it's still not the best. We still end up getting bycatch that dies in these nets, but by having escape doors, organisms like larger fish and sea turtles can hopefully escape out of these nets before they drown or get killed. So what are you supposed to do when you're at the grocery store? Well, ask questions, read labels, and see if the fish that you are choosing has any certification that certifies that it is sustainably harvested. For example, here are some advice items from the Seafood Choices Alliance. First, ask yourself if this fish is really what people say it is. Next, figure out if the fish is farmed or wild caught. And if it is farmed, what type of production system was used? If it was wild caught, where was the fish caught and how was it caught? Next, ask yourself, should it be caught? Some fish species are on endangered species lists, and if there are fishery management issues, then maybe we should choose an alternative. And that leads us to our last piece of advice: find fish substitutions. If some type of fish is causing problems, then choose a sustainable alternative. All right, well, that wraps up case study number 2. And I hope that even if you personally do not eat fish, I hope this was very informative. And it really set the stage for helping us understand global biodiversity issues that we will then apply to our next case study. Thank you so much for listening. Please email me with any questions.